My name is Jake Henderson, and I'm 29 years old. I want to tell you about the summer I almost didn't survive. This happened only a year ago in the remote desert lands near the Navajo Nation in northern Arizona. Back then, I was seeking adventure, a break from the ordinary routine of my day job in Denver. I had saved up enough to buy a second-hand RV, an older but sturdy model that I believed could handle the desert roads. Looking back, the RV was the least of my worries. What we encountered out there still haunts me every time I close my eyes. Should start with how the trip came together. I'd been talking with my best friend Luis for months about taking a road trip to photograph the star-filled skies of the Southwest. Luis is the same age as me, and we've known each other since college. He's the type who's always hungry for something new and dramatic, always up for an adrenaline rush. Lately, he'd become obsessed with filming everything on his phone, for social media. Nature walks, climbs, hidden watering holes. He'd post them all with clickbait titles and watch the views roll in. He convinced me that this trip could become our big break if we found truly stunning or mysterious content to share online. Tagging along was my girlfriend Natalie, who is 27. She's an artist, a meticulous observer of her surroundings. Natalie has a way of noticing subtle details. A strange bird call, a shift in the wind, the flicker of movement in a dark corner. She's also the steadying force who keeps me and Luis from tearing each other's heads off when we disagree. Rounding out our small group was Sadie, who had never been on a big RV trip before. She's Luis's cousin, 24, a little shy yet eager to prove that she could handle the desert. I remember the look in her eyes when we embarked. Equal, parts excitement and raw nerves. We set out in mid-August, hoping to capture some clear night skies. The plan was straightforward. Drive south from Colorado, cross into Arizona, and aim for the outskirts of Monument Valley or Canyon de Chelly. We wanted to camp in places not teeming with tourists, and I thought I'd done enough research to keep us safe. I figured we'd rely on designated campsites near the Navajo Nation, or at least stay close to main roads. But as soon as we started the journey, Luis began pushing for more remote spots. For the footage, he kept insisting. People have seen 1,000 pictures of Monument Valley from the highway. We gotta go deeper. The first few days passed smoothly. The drive was long, but we were all in high spirits, singing along to old playlists, stopping for scenic overlooks, snapping photos of towering red rock formations. The southwestern sun glared overhead during the day, but the nights were surprisingly cool. On our third evening, we found a public campsite. Not official, but definitely known to some travelers, just a short distance off a gravel road. It was mostly desert scrub with the occasional stunted juniper tree. Mountains lined the horizon, far in the distance, their silhouettes barely visible in the fading light. I remember how the RV rumbled with a faint mechanical growl that night, something subtle in the generator's hum. My mechanical knowledge was limited, and we were too tired to fuss over it. We set up a small bonfire, lit some citronella candles to ward off insects, and shared beers under a purple sky. I felt at peace, even though the campsite was eerily silent once the fire died down. No crickets, no hooting owls, just an expanse of quiet that pressed in like a physical weight on my ears. Natalie commented on it, said something like, "It's so still out here that it doesn't feel real." I shrugged, but I couldn't shake a hint of unease. By our fourth day, we were miles deeper into the desert, following a narrow dirt track that deviated from any major route. The plan was to find a scenic place to park for the evening, do some hiking, maybe gather unique footage for Luis. The dryness and heat intensified, so we had to ration our water carefully. Around noon, a tire blew out on a stony patch of the road. Changing it under the blazing sun turned out to be a nightmare. The lug nuts were stuck, and the jack kept sinking into the sand. Tempers flared. Luis and I exchanged words, and Sadie looked on, clearly uncomfortable. Natalie kept telling us to calm down, eventually rummaging in the RV for a plank of wood to help stabilize the jack. We managed to swap out the tire, but the mood had soured. The strain began to show. I was irritated that Luis insisted on these roads, and he was frustrated that I kept hesitating whenever he suggested going farther off map. Meanwhile, the horizon stretched out endlessly, with red and orange dust swirling in the distance. We pressed on another hour, finally stumbling on a rocky ledge with a panoramic view of a shallow canyon. It seemed safe enough to park the RV, so we settled in. We had the place to ourselves. No sign of other travelers, not even those meandering RV folks you sometimes encounter. That evening, the generator's problems worsened. The interior lights flickered and the air conditioner sputtered. I fiddled, with the fuse box to no avail. We'd have to rely mostly on flashlights and battery-powered lanterns. As the sun slipped beneath the horizon, painting the sky in bands of crimson and gold, I noticed a shift in the air. The wind picked up, cool and insistent, carrying with it a faint odor that reminded me of a wet dog. When I asked if anyone else smelled it, Luis said it was probably some coyote or mountain lion kill rotting in the desert. Natalie crinkled her nose in doubt, but we shrugged it off and began making dinner. Our plan was to rest and do a short hike at dawn. We never got that peaceful rest. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of scratching on the outside of the RV. At first, I assumed it was just a rodent or stray cat, but the scratching grew methodical, traveling along the side of the RV's metal frame in long, deliberate drags. I sat up, heart pounding. The night was pitch black aside from the moonlight shining through the small window above my bunk. Carefully, I peered through the curtain. At first I saw nothing, just an expanse of open desert. But as my eyes adjusted, I caught a flicker of movement near a rock formation about 50 yards away. Something moved on all fours, then slowly rose to 2 legs. My brain couldn't reconcile the shape. It looked like a tall, thin figure, vaguely human in outline but contorted in ways that made my skin crawl. I froze, struggling to breathe. Then, in an instant, it slinked out of sight behind the rocks. I waited, counting the seconds until the desert became silent again. Adrenaline coursed through me, but I managed to muster the courage to quietly check on the others. Natalie was stirring from the noise. She whispered, "What was that?" I didn't want to scare her further, so I just muttered something about a stray animal. But neither of us slept well the rest of the night. By morning, I'd rationalized what I'd seen into something natural, a trick of the moonlight, maybe a coyote that stood on its hind legs momentarily. Yet I felt an uneasy weight in my chest. We ate a modest breakfast, each of us subdued. Sadie asked if we'd heard something in the night, but Luis teased her. "Probably your imagination. You're just jumpy." She looked offended, but didn't press it. We decided to try the short hike, a half-mile loop that descended into the shallow canyon. Natalie wanted to photograph some unique rock patterns, and Luis was itching for new video content. The hike proved underwhelming. The canyon was more of a dried wash. No water, no interesting wildlife. Yet, halfway along the trail, Sadie gasped. She discovered footprints in the sandy soil near the canyon wall. We stooped to examine them. They were like a person's footprints, but longer, with what looked like claw indentations at the tips of each toe. A coyote or wolf track was smaller, narrower. These prints were large enough to belong to a tall man, but the shape was all wrong. Luis muttered something about it being a hoax or an odd erosion pattern, but Sadie remained pale and quiet, hugging, her arms against the morning chill. We turned back sooner than planned. As we crested the rim of the canyon, we spotted an older man walking along the same trail, leaning on a carved walking stick. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and had weathered skin that suggested a lifetime under the desert sun. When we drew closer, he regarded us with a stern expression. I offered a friendly greeting, something about how beautiful the area was. He looked at Luis's camera gear, then at Sadie's anxious face, and said softly, "You shouldn't be out here alone. Things you don't understand." I asked him if he was from around here. and he nodded once, then spoke in measured tones. My people warn about shape changers in these parts. Not all stories are just stories. Then, as if to punctuate the message, he turned and continued, down the trail. I stood there, uneasy, the desert wind ruffling my hair. We returned to the RV, the mood now darker. Luis rolled his eyes at the mention of shape changers, but he also couldn't fully explain the footprints. Natalie asked if we should move on, maybe head back closer to a real campground. I agreed, but we needed to eat and rest a bit before driving the bumpy back road again. By late afternoon, we packed up. The RV roared to life, only to shudder after a few minutes on the trail. The engine sputtered, then died. I glanced at the temperature gauge. It was overheating. Our coolant was low, and I hadn't noticed. Furious. With myself, I rummaged for a spare jug of antifreeze, only to realize we didn't have enough. Luis growled something about how we should have stocked up properly. We argued, voices carrying across the dusty air, until Natalie snapped at us to stop. Sadie, eyes darting nervously at the horizon, asked what we'd do if we couldn't get the engine started again. I told them we'd have to wait a while for the engine to cool, then try adding what we had and see if it got us far enough to reach some roadside station or convenience store. The sun was setting, and with it, the desert seemed to draw in close around us, as if it had been waiting for darkness. That night, we set up a small circle of lanterns. A desert wind had started to blow, strong enough that we doubted we could light a campfire safely without it whipping sparks into a potential wildfire. Instead, we huddled by the RV door, sharing uneasy conversation. Every so often we thought we heard howls, but they sounded deeper and more guttural than any coyote. Natalie swore she heard them mimic the cadence of human speech, low moans, forming something almost like words. Sadie, hugging her knees, asked if we believed in skinwalkers. She'd been researching Navajo folklore during the day, spooked by the footprints and the elder's warning. I tried to reassure her, but my voice came out hollow. Luis kept swiveling his phone camera around, though he was too rattled to crack, his usual jokes. Around midnight, the wind died down abruptly, as if some cosmic hand turned a dial. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then came a scraping sound from behind the RV. We leaped to our feet. Luis, wanting footage, aimed his phone's flashlight. We ventured toward the back, hearts hammering. Something had scratched a ragged pattern along the side of the vehicle. 4 parallel lines, each a deep groove in the metal. I ran my fingertips over them and shuddered. It looked like something with claws had deliberately marked our only means of transportation. A sudden scuffling noise made us jerk around. I swept my flashlight across the desert. For a split second, the beam illuminated a figure standing about 20 yards away. It was tall, scrawny, bent at odd angles. Its head seemed partly looping, snout-like, but I could make out a vaguely human shape to the torso. My heart nearly stopped. The thing recoiled from the brightness, then moved with impossible speed behind, a jutting rock. All 4 of us stood there breathless, pulses thudding in our ears. Finally, Sadie let out a whimper. We stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door, barricading ourselves inside. Luis locked the door, hands trembling. Natalie went to the windows, triple-checking that they were secure. The RV felt stifling, even with the vent open, as if the fear we were generating was enough to fill the small space with oppressive heat. We agreed to keep watch in shifts. I volunteered to go first, shotgun in my lap. Yes, I had a shotgun stored. For emergencies. Wild animals, mainly. But until that night, I never truly believed I'd need it for something beyond my grasp of understanding. My shift passed with every nerve on high alert. Outside, the scraping resumed at intervals, always distant, as if to remind me it was out there. Twice I glimpsed a silhouette pass by the windows. Each time I tensed, expecting the creature to try to break in. Morning crept in slowly, gray light easing over the horizon. Sleep-deprived and stiff, I stumbled outside to check the engine again. My eyes immediately fell on fresh damage. The front tires were slashed. 5 parallel gashes cut deep into the rubber of both wheels. My stomach twisted. We were officially stuck. I kicked the RV's fender in frustration, wincing at my own folly of coming so far from paved roads. Luis joined me, cursing under his breath. "So, now what?" Sadie asked, her voice shaky. We had 1 spare left, already used, and we had no means of calling for help. No cell signal, not even a single bar. The shortwave radio that came with the RV had a broken antenna. We'd been meaning to fix it, but never got around to it. We decided our best chance was to ration supplies, remain near the RV, and hope we could wave down a passing vehicle. That meant waiting, maybe for days. The idea of traveling on foot across miles of desert with limited water was reckless, and we had no certainty which direction a highway might lie. Reluctantly, we set up a perimeter with makeshift alarms, tin cans tied to string, old wind chimes we found in a storage cubby inside the RV. It felt laughably inadequate against whatever was out there, but we had to do something. That afternoon, as we tried to conserve energy inside the stifling RV, we heard the distant rumble of an approaching truck. Luis and I dashed outside, jumping up and down, waving our arms. Sure enough, an old pickup truck ambled along the dusty trail. Relief flooded my chest. The driver was a middle-aged Navajo man, wearing a baseball cap with a local rodeo logo. He slowed, his face growing cautious as he saw the desperation in our expressions. We explained our predicament, and he eyed the slash marks on the tires. He didn't speak much at first, just nodded solemnly. Then he offered to tow us to a small rest stop area about an hour's drive away. We accepted, immeasurably grateful. During that slow, bumpy ride behind his truck, we conversed a bit through the open windows. He told us we were near ground that some folks don't visit, that it was known for rumors of skinwalkers. He didn't elaborate much, but his tone was final. Sadie asked if we were in real danger. He said something cryptic about how once a skinwalker has you in its sights, it may follow you. I wanted to scoff at the notion, creatures crossing vast distances to hunt us like we were prey. But after what we'd seen, I couldn't dismiss the possibility outright. At the rest stop, which turned out to be a small gas station with a single pump and a battered convenience store, we parted ways with the man, thanking him profusely. He left us with a warning to get your RV fixed and go home. Inside the store, a young clerk with a bored expression told us we could wait for a traveling mechanic who came by weekly, or she could make a call for a tow truck from the nearest town, about 2 hours away. She tried phoning, got static and repeated disconnections before managing to place the request. We were told to expect a tow in 3 to 4 hours. That was the first good news we'd had in days. While waiting, we drank cold sodas and tried to calm our frazzled nerves. Luis fiddled with his camera, reviewing the footage from the previous night. I watched over his shoulder as the screen showed near darkness, except for the moment when the flashlight caught that shape. The figure in the video was distant but undeniably there, an elongated outline with eyes reflecting back eerily, like an animal's. My heart pounded just seeing it again. Natalie urged him not to post it anywhere. "We don't even know what we're dealing with," she said. "This isn't about going viral." A few hours stretched into nearly 5 before a battered tow truck rumbled into the station's parking lot. The driver, a stout man in oil-stained overalls, hopped out. We explained the tire situation and the generator issues. He agreed to tow us to a small auto shop in a nearby town. By then, dusk was encroaching once more. The driver said he could haul the RV that same night, but it would be late by the time we arrived. Tense but out of options, we all crammed into the cab of the truck as our RV was chained up behind us. The driver made small talk at first, but gradually he fell silent, noticing our jittery behavior. We must have looked like we'd seen ghosts. We traveled in the dark for about an hour, the headlights catching dust swirling across the empty highway. The only other vehicles we passed were distant semis or the occasional pair of headlights heading in the opposite direction. Luis kept glancing out the back window at our RV as if expecting to see something slithering around it. Sadie clutched her phone, perhaps hoping for a signal. Natalie stared blankly at the black silhouettes of mesas and buttes, her face lined with worry. Suddenly the truck lurched. The engine sputtered, then roared, then sputtered again. I exchanged a worried look with the driver. He grunted, "Damn, not now," and tried to coax it onward. We advanced another half-mile before it died completely. Coasting to the shoulder, the driver cursed under his breath. He fiddled with the ignition, but the starter just clicked. Meanwhile, we all spilled out into the night air. The desert was cooler now, but still my skin prickled with sweat. A wave of déjà vu hit me, stranded again at night in the middle of nowhere. The driver rummaged under the hood. I stepped away to scan. The darkness, half expecting to see something bounding toward us on all fours. Luis got a flashlight and aimed it around while Sadie and Natalie stood by the truck. The driver asked me to hold the light so he could check the engine belts. I could see fear in his eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. This man had likely driven these roads countless times, but perhaps he'd heard the same stories as the Navajo elder or the man who rescued us earlier. And maybe on a night like this, he believed them. Then we heard a sound that froze my blood. A wailing cry, so loud it seemed to bounce off the distant rock formations. It started as a coyote's yelp, then morphed into something with a twisted semblance of human shrieking. Natalie pressed her hands to her ears, tears glistening. Sadie stifled a scream. The driver muttered, "Jesus," under his breath, and from the look on his face I could tell he had no illusions about common wildlife. Luis aimed his flashlight past the headlight's glow beyond the desert brush. At the far edge of the beam, a pair of eyes glinted, a shape that stood in that half-man, half-beast posture. For a moment, none of us moved. My muscles tensed, preparing to run or fight. I wasn't sure which. The creature jerked forward, crossing, a gap of 20 feet in a blur. Its motion was unnatural, an awkward gallop that ended in a leap onto a nearby boulder. Now it was elevated, its silhouette black against the starry sky. Up close, I could see matted fur around its elongated arms, and a face that was neither fully animal nor human, twisted in a grotesque snarl. The driver dropped his wrench, mouth agape. Luis fumbled for his phone, but I snatched his wrist. No time for filming, we had to do something. We scrambled back into the truck's cab, but the engine was still lifeless. I grabbed my shotgun from the RV. Thankfully, I'd carried it in the tow truck. My hands shook as I loaded 2 shells. The driver muttered, "Are you crazy?" But he climbed in the back seat and slammed the door behind him. Outside, the creature howled again, and I could see it creeping closer. My heart hammered so hard I wondered if I'd pass out from the sheer intensity of it all. I rolled down the window just enough to point the barrel. For an agonizing second, I saw the monster's pale eyes reflect in the moonlight. I pulled the trigger. The deafening blast lit up the night and the recoil slammed into my shoulder. Dirt and dust exploded near the boulder. When the smoke cleared, the shape was gone. I swallowed, adrenaline buzzing in my skull. "Drive! Drive!" Luis shouted at the driver. But the truck was still dead. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. We locked ourselves in, tried calling 911 on our phones. No signal. The driver tried using his radio, but it only hissed static. Outside, an echoing moan seemed to circle us, as if the creature was running around, testing angles, waiting for a moment to strike. Natalie's eyes were wide with terror. Sadie was praying under her breath, and Luis gripped the seat, knuckles white. Then the truck rocked violently, throwing me against the steering wheel. The passenger side mirror cracked. I heard scraping, metal. Another slam came from behind, jostling the cabin. I realized with horror that the creature was attacking from various points to find a weakness. I reloaded the shotgun, my hands slick with sweat. Suddenly, the driver tried the ignition again. Miraculously, it coughed to life. The headlights flickered, but the engine roared. Without a word, he floored the gas. The truck lurched forward, dragging the RV. I hung halfway out the window, scanning the side. My ears were ringing with fear and the residual echo of the gunshot. We sped down the empty highway, the engine rattling as though it might give out at any moment. I spotted something sprinting alongside the truck, a dark blur that kept pace for a few terrifying seconds. I fired a second shot, though I'm not sure I hit anything. Whatever it was peeled away, lost in the blackness. But I couldn't be sure it was gone for good. We managed to keep going until we reached a flickering neon sign that announced Motel and Diner, 1 mile. Relief crashed over me. We pulled in, tires screeching. The bright fluorescent lights of the parking lot felt like stepping into a sanctuary after the nightmare roads. The driver hopped out, panting, eyes wide, scanning the desert. Luis helped Sadie out of the back seat, her legs trembling. Natalie leaned against me, tears streaming down her face. I realized I was shaking, too, the shotgun still in my hands. The motel clerk, an older woman, rushed out at the commotion. We must have looked half mad as we tried to explain. She let us take 2 rooms, one for me and Natalie, one for Luis and Sadie, and told us to lock ourselves in. She said she'd call the sheriff's office in the morning, as it was no time for folks to be out wandering. Despite the flickering sign and peeling paint, that motel felt like the safest place on earth at that moment. We collapsed in our rooms. Natalie curled into me, and I held her, whispering assurances I didn't quite believe myself. Through the window's thin curtains, I could see the parking lot. The tow truck and our RV looked battered under the buzzing fluorescent lamp. Every so often, a breeze stirred the desert dust, sending it skittering across the asphalt. I barely slept. Each time my eyelids drooped, I heard again that inhuman howl, or felt the rock of the truck, or saw those yellow eyes glaring at me in the darkness. Morning brought fresh light, but not necessarily peace. When we woke, the clerk informed us that the local sheriff's office was sending a deputy to hear our story. We spent an hour sipping weak coffee waiting by the front desk. Eventually, a weathered deputy showed up, listened to our account with a stony face, and asked if we'd been drinking or using any substances. That angered me at first, but I understood how our story must have sounded. Luis showed him the partial footage on his phone. The deputy studied it, chewing his lip. He didn't say we were lying, just that the area had some unsolved wildlife issues. He offered to take a statement, make a report, but suggested we should move on with our travels. "I'm not sure there's much else we can do," he said. It was clear that the region's law enforcement was neither equipped nor eager to chase down stories of shapeshifters. The best they could do was help us find a mechanic to fix the RV. The Skinwalker, or whatever it was, remained an untouchable horror lurking in the desert. It took 2 days for the shop to patch up the RV, replace the tires, and do a cursory repair on the generator. We stayed at the motel, never venturing out after dark. Each evening, we heard a distant chorus of coyotes, and each time my heart skipped a beat, worried I'd hear that unnatural twist in their howls. We debated cutting the trip short. Sadie outright refused to continue exploring the back roads. Natalie was in silent agreement. Luis was uncharacteristically quiet. I think the reality of how close we came to disaster had rattled him deeply. I just wanted to get us all home. On the 3rd morning, we loaded up. The sun was shining. The sky was a pure cobalt blue, seemingly so innocent compared to the horrors we'd witnessed. As we drove north, back toward Colorado, no one said much. We'd left behind the desert, but the sense of being watched never completely dissipated. Even with the bright day spread out before us, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a distorted figure loping along behind the RV. We passed the gas station where we'd first been towed. The clerk waved goodbye from inside. Or maybe I imagined it. Soon, the rock formations grew smaller, the land gradually shifting into more familiar highways lined with commercial signs. The tension in the RV lifted a fraction, though no one could fully exhale until we crossed the state line out of Arizona. 3 days after that, we arrived back in Denver. I parked the RV in my apartment's lot, thinking I'd never set foot in it again. The next week, I had nightmares that left me drenched in sweat. I'd see the creature's eyes peering through the RV window or hear the scraping of claws along metal. Natalie, too, would wake up gasping in the middle of the night. Luis tried to distract himself by editing the footage, but I convinced him not to post it. We didn't need fame or attention from that. Sadie withdrew, unwilling to talk about the experience to anyone. After a month, she moved in with her sister on the East Coast, far from desert landscapes. Time has dimmed some of the raw edges of my fear, but it hasn't erased it. I kept the shotgun by my bed for weeks after returning, flinching at every creak in the night. At work, coworkers asked how our big adventure went, and I gave them a bland summary about car trouble and a cut-short vacation. They never suspected the deeper terror behind my eyes. Sometimes I think about that Navajo elder we met. He warned us not to wander after dark. We didn't listen. We went too deep, in search of novelty and thrills, disrespecting warnings that had been passed down through generations. We faced something that didn't belong in our rational world. And even now, I occasionally sense a presence lurking in my dreams, reminding me that certain corners of this world aren't meant for casual explorers. I still have the RV, though I rarely drive it. Every now and then, I take it for a quick spin around the neighborhood, just to keep the engine in shape. Those scratches, those 4 parallel lines, remain on the back panel. I never had the bodywork repaired. It's like a scar, a reminder that what we saw wasn't some fevered delusion. When I run my fingers over those deep grooves, I can almost hear the wind and smell the wet dog odor from that night. We survived, though I know many who tell stories of skinwalkers claim not everyone is so lucky. Death didn't claim us out there, but something else did. A piece of our innocence, our unwavering belief that the world was neatly categorized and understandable. That piece is gone forever, and so I tell this story not to scare anyone, but to warn them. My name is Jake Henderson. I'm 29 years old, and this happened only a year ago. Don't stray too far off the beaten path in places you don't understand. And if someone warns you about shape changers in the desert, take it seriously. Because some legends, as I learned, are more than stories. They have teeth, and they're always hungry. My name is Mike Reynolds, and I'm 45 years old. This happened last fall during a trip I took through the Adirondacks in upstate New York. I'd bought a used RV that summer, a somewhat battered vehicle that appealed to me precisely because of its flaws. I'd been alone for about 1.5 years by then, ever since my wife, Nora, passed away from a sudden illness. Some people in my life called the trip an escape. Others said it was an attempt to find closure. Maybe it was both. All I knew was that I needed to get out, see something different, stop staring at the walls of our once shared apartment. The Adirondacks, with its miles of isolated forests and serene lakes, seemed like the perfect place to lose myself, even if it was just for a little while. I set out in early September, when the leaves were just beginning to show a hint of color. The drive from my home in Massachusetts was pleasant enough. Rolling highways, scenic overlooks, farmland turning into denser forest. My RV rattled and groaned whenever I hit a bump, but the engine was reliable, and I found a certain comfort in the rhythmic hum of its tires on the road. I planned to wander through several spots in the Adirondack Park, parking at established campgrounds or pulling off onto smaller, lesser-known ones. It was past peak tourist season, so I figured I'd find plenty of peaceful corners to settle into. On the first day, I only made it as far as a fairly standard campsite near Lake Placid. It had a handful of other travelers, some tents, a few other RVs, and a general hum of activity that felt safe, if not exactly the solitude I was seeking. I stayed there one night, then pushed on in the morning, following a narrow road deeper into the park. It was midweek, and the sky was a perfect, endless blue. My mind wandered to memories of Nora and me taking day trips to spots like this. She always joked that I was too city-bound, that I needed to immerse myself in nature, maybe get lost on a forest trail. I tried to set those memories aside, unsure if they comforted or wounded me more. Eventually, I found a place that looked promising, a small campsite off a gravel road that branched away from a county highway. The sign at the entrance was old, the paint peeling, but it listed a series of lots for overnight parking and a few rough trails that looped around a lake whose name I'd never heard before. Oakwood Lake. The name didn't appear on any major tourist maps, which meant quiet. Perfect. That was what I wanted, or so I believed. The camp area consisted of maybe 6 or 7 cleared spots, all spaced far apart. A single lane of gravel wound through stands of pine, hemlock, and birch. No other vehicles appeared to be there when I pulled in. A check-in station stood near the entrance, just a wooden kiosk with a map and some instructions to deposit a small fee in an envelope. I did as asked, writing down my license plate and the length of my stay. A few nights, though I kept my plan flexible. Then I followed the path deeper until I found the site marked number 3, which had a decent view of the lake through the trees. A good chunk of the shoreline was visible. Calm water tinted silver by the midday sun, a small fishing pier in the distance, and clusters of reeds near the bank. I parked the RV on a level patch of ground. Silence enveloped me as soon as I turned off the ignition. It was so still I could hear the faint buzz of insects and the gentle lapping of water against the rocks. For a moment, I let out a long breath, feeling tension ease from my shoulders. Maybe this was exactly what I needed. I hopped out, stretched, and decided to walk down to the water's edge. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, the crisp tang that announces the start of autumn. The breeze ruffled the surface of the lake, creating small ripples. I tried to picture Nora standing here, arms folded, telling me to soak it all in. The image filled me with a dull ache, but also a strange sense of companionship, as if her spirit were somehow near. The first afternoon passed without incident. I set up my little outdoor chair, read a book for a couple hours, and then made a simple meal on the RV's stovetop. As night fell, the sky clouded over, blocking most of the stars, but the air remained relatively mild. I sat there listening to frogs croaking along the shore. By 10 o'clock, my eyelids grew heavy, and I turned in for the night. My sleep was restless, though. I kept waking to the sound of soft splashing, as if someone was wading in the shallows, but each time I peeked through the RV's small windows, I saw nothing but darkness. My flashlight revealed only silent trees and the mirrored surface of the water. Eventually, I chalked it up to nerves. Being out here alone did funny things to my imagination. In the morning, I debated exploring the trail loops or maybe searching for a store to restock my supplies. My coffee canister was running low, and I knew I'd want more if I stayed multiple days. I ended up driving into the nearest small town, which was around 20 minutes away along winding roads. It turned out to be just a single main street with a row of old buildings, a gas station, and a general store. The store's sign read, White's General and Gifts, with a small wooden bear out front. Inside, it smelled faintly of cinnamon and cedar. The place was cramped but packed with essentials, canned goods, tools, souvenir t-shirts, postcards. I loaded up on coffee, water, and a few extra snacks, planning to hole up at the campsite for at least a couple more nights. At the register, I met Catherine White, a friendly woman in her 60s. She had short gray hair and a kind face creased with years of smiles. She rang up my items and asked where I was camping. When I told her Oakwood Lake, she paused, giving me a quizzical look. Not many folks go there. It's pretty quiet. You by yourself? She asked. I nodded. She pursed her lips and said, You just be careful up that way, okay? The weather can turn fast in the fall, and watch out for the wildlife. Black bears, bobcats, you name it. I appreciated the warning. though something in her tone suggested there was more she wanted to say. I paid, thanked her, and headed back to the RV. On my way out of town, I stopped at a gas station. While I was fueling up, a park ranger truck pulled in. The ranger, a man maybe in his 40s with a subdued expression, stepped out. He gave me a polite nod. I introduced myself and asked if he knew anything about Oakwood Lake, if it was safe. He shrugged. Been some sightings of coyotes, maybe a bear or two, but that's normal for this area. No major concerns, just keep your food sealed up. Then he added, "You camping alone?" When I said yes, he smiled faintly. "Well, nothing to worry about if you follow basic guidelines. Just don't go wandering after dark. Gets easy too, lose your way." I thanked him and left, feeling a small rush of confidence. If that was the worst of it, I could handle it. But I also noticed how he made no mention of ghosts or legends. Probably the silly notion swirling in the back of my mind after the splashes I'd heard. I shook it off as nonsense. I returned to the campground, and by mid-afternoon, I was once again sprawled in my camping chair, reading. I tried to truly let the environment envelop me. The golden sunlight filtering through branches, the crunch of leaves when squirrels darted around. But something niggled at me. It felt too quiet. I realized I hadn't seen another camper the entire time I'd been there. No cars, no tents, no other RVs. True, it was off-season, but it was unusual to have a public site entirely to myself. Maybe it wasn't used much. Or maybe there was a reason. As evening approached, clouds gathered again. I decided to turn in early, anticipating rain. Around 8, I climbed into bed. A few hours later, I found myself wide awake to the sound of laughter. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the faint giggling continued, drifting in through the thin walls of the RV. It was the high-pitched sound of a child's laugh, echoing near the water. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. As far as I knew, I was alone out here. The laughter persisted, then faded into the soft hush of the breeze. I scrambled out of bed and carefully opened the RV door. Armed with a flashlight, I ventured a few steps toward the lake. Nothing moved, yet I swore I could sense a presence. My pulse thudded in my ears as I swept the beam of light along the shore. The rocks and mud glistened, but there were no footprints, no sign of a living soul. At length, I backed away, more unnerved than I cared to admit. By the time I crawled into bed, I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling in the dark, drifting in and out of uneasy dreams. Morning brought a heavy fog rolling in across the lake, blanketing the water in a thick, shifting veil. I opened the RV door and stepped out, inhaling the cool, damp air. My nerves still felt raw from the night. I told myself it must have been the wind. Some sounds can mimic laughter, especially if it's rustling through branches or echoing off the surface of water. Rational explanations, I repeated silently, trying to quiet the growing dread in my mind. Feeling restless, I decided to walk one of the short loop trails that circled a portion of the lake. I left the RV locked and set out with a small day pack. The trail, covered in pine needles, wound gently through a mix of evergreen and deciduous trees. The fog never fully lifted, leaving the forest dim and otherworldly even as noon approached. My footsteps sounded muffled against the carpet of fallen leaves. After about half a mile, the path meandered back to the lake shore, where a small clearing offered a panoramic view. I stopped, letting my eyes roam across the water's surface. That was when I noticed footprints by the water. They were small, child-sized, pressed into the soft mud. They led from the shallows up onto the bank, then stopped abruptly near a cluster of rocks. My scalp prickled. I crouched to examine them. Definitely footprints, bare feet, the toes distinct and splayed. They were fresh enough that water was still pooled in them. My brain started spinning. Could there really be a child out here alone? Had a family come and left while I was away? It didn't add up. The campsite was empty when I returned yesterday. And besides, why would a child be roaming the lakeshore in the middle of the night? I was so absorbed in these thoughts that I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard someone clear their throat behind me. I whirled around, only to see an older man standing a dozen paces away. He was thin, wearing a weathered jacket and holding a walking stick. It took me a moment to realize he must have come from the other direction on the trail. I hadn't heard him at all. He regarded me with a curious expression. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said quietly. I thought I was the only one out this way. I stammered a greeting, still rattled. The man introduced himself as Frank. He told me his wife, Rose, was back at their camper near the trailhead on the other side of the lake. They were passing through and decided to spend a night here after, seeing the sign at the entrance. I let out a breath of relief that I wasn't totally alone. Frank asked if I was traveling solo, and I nodded. Then, perhaps emboldened by my confusion, I pointed at the footprints. "Do you think a kid could be out here on their own?" I asked. He studied them for a moment, frowning. "Strange," he murmured. "We haven't seen anybody else." He gave me a sidelong glance that told me he found this as unsettling, as I did. We walked back together, exchanging small talk. His camper was an old trailer, pulled by a sturdy truck. It was parked in a spot I hadn't noticed the day before, likely because it was around the bend. We greeted Rose, a kind-faced woman with silver hair, and she offered me coffee. We stood around their tiny fold-out table making the kind of conversation strangers make. Where we were from, how long we intended to stay, what attractions we might see next. But the footprints hovered in my mind, and I sensed Frank and Rose were uneasy too, though none of us wanted to say it aloud. Before I left, Rose asked, "You haven't heard anything strange at night, have you?" The question made my skin crawl. I admitted quietly that I thought I heard laughter by the lake. She inhaled sharply, glancing at her husband. Frank nodded grimly. "We heard something too, but thought maybe it was an animal or the wind." None of us wanted to call it ghostly or supernatural, but we all felt it. A creeping sense that there was more to this place than we understood. I returned to my RV, determined to gather more information. My mind went back to Catherine at the general store. She'd looked at me oddly when I mentioned Oakwood Lake. Perhaps I should talk to her again. I decided I'd make a trip the next morning. Meanwhile, I'd stay one more night because part of me, maybe the stubborn part, refused to be scared away by unexplainable noises and footprints. Night came with a steady drizzle. Raindrops pattered on the RV's roof, and I sat in my small dinette, absent-mindedly stirring a bowl of soup. The gloom pressed in from all sides. I turned on my battery-powered lantern since I wanted to conserve the RV's internal battery. Around 9, thunder rumbled in the distance. By 10, the storm intensified, whipping the branches of the nearby trees. The lake was just visible through the windows. Dark, turbulent water reflecting the sporadic flash of lightning. At some point in the night, I jolted awake. At first I wasn't sure why, but then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the side of the RV, like tiny knuckles. The wind rattled the windows, making everything in me want to stay where I was, huddled under my blankets. But fear and curiosity pushed me to flick on the lantern and step carefully to the door. The tapping continued, occasionally punctuated by the drip of rain from the gutters. I cracked the door open just an inch, shining my flashlight out into the storm. No one was there, yet the tapping seemed to move around to the back of the RV. I closed the door, my heart hammering, and peered through the rear window. Lightning flashed, illuminating the shape of a small figure standing by the bumper. I caught the briefest glimpse: slender arms, pale face, hair plastered by the rain. My heart lurched into my throat. I shouted, "Hey!" and fumbled to open the door so I could circle around. But by the time I got outside, boots squelching in the mud, the figure was gone. Wind and rain lashed me, forcing me to retreat within moments. I stood there, soaked and shaking. Sleep was impossible after that. I kept vigil, shotgun at my side, though I wasn't even sure what I planned to do with it. Shoot a child? Shoot a ghost? My mind was in turmoil. When dawn finally arrived, I stepped out into a gray, drizzling morning, water dripping from every leaf, the air clammy. My gut told me to leave, to just pack up and go. Yet, a deeper part of me needed to know the story behind this place. Maybe it was the guilt I carried over Nora's death, some twisted sense of empathy with a spirit that might be lost, wandering. I couldn't articulate it, only that I felt compelled. I decided to drive to the store again, see if Catherine would tell me more. On my way out, I passed Frank and Rose's trailer site. To my surprise, they were hooking it up to their truck, clearly ready to go. I stopped and rolled down my window. Frank walked over, his face tense. "We're leaving," he said bluntly. "Rose had a bad scare last night. She woke up and saw someone standing at our window, a girl or something. By the time I got my flashlight, there was no one there, but the footprints in the mud." He trailed off. "I'm not staying." Part of me was relieved I wasn't, alone in witnessing these events, but I also felt a chill. They had only planned to stay one night, but it was obvious they'd be leaving as soon as possible regardless. I wished them safe travels, fighting back the urge to chase after them. I told myself I needed answers, so I continued on to town. Catherine was behind the counter again, restocking a display of knitted scarves. She gave me a polite smile, but her eyes flicked to the window, noting the drizzle. "You're back," she said softly. "Do you need something else?" I exhaled, then recounted my experiences carefully at first, mentioning only the laughter at night, the odd footprints. Her gaze sharpened. She guided me to a corner of the store where nobody could overhear, not that there were any other customers, and sighed. "I was afraid that place might still be unsettled," she murmured. She led me to a small binder near the register, a local history scrapbook. Sifting through yellowed newspaper clippings, she explained that many years ago, a young girl had drowned in Oakwood Lake under tragic circumstances. There were whispers in the community that she'd been neglected, left unsupervised while her parents were off drinking or gallivanting around. One of the clippings had a faded photograph of the lake's shore, roped off by police tape, and the blurred silhouette of a child's body in the water. Catherine said that after the incident, strange sightings started. Campers hearing a child weeping or laughing, seeing fleeting figures near the shoreline at night. The site became less popular over time, overshadowed by rumors of a haunting. Felt a lump in my throat. "So, you believe in that?" I asked. She hesitated before saying, "I believe that sometimes tragedy leaves echoes, and some echoes don't fade easily." I stared at the photo, then told Catherine about the figure I saw by my RV. She nodded solemnly. "If that spirit is restless, it might be drawn to someone who's carrying grief. Spirits sense that empathy, or so some folks say." The notion made my stomach tighten. Was this lost child's ghost sensing my own sorrow over Nora? She laid a gentle hand on my arm. "Please be careful," she said. "You can't solve the past by yourself. If the place is truly haunted, there might not be a neat resolution. Sometimes the best thing is to move on." But I wasn't sure I could do that, not yet. I thanked her, bought a couple items I didn't really need, and headed back to the RV. On the drive up the highway, I caught sight of Ranger Ellis again, parked by the side of the road. I pulled over and waved him down. He recognized me, though he looked puzzled at my grim expression. I told him, in more factual detail, about the footprints, the nightly laughter, the childlike figure at my RV. At first, he seemed skeptical, but when I mentioned the drowning from years ago, he scratched his chin. "I've heard old stories," he said, "but we don't document ghost sightings in any official capacity." He recommended I pack up and find a more populated campsite if it was spooking me. That was his official suggestion. Off the record, he gave a small shrug and said, "Some places hold on to sad memories, I guess." He didn't try to stop me from returning, but he didn't encourage me either. I understood. Park rangers probably prefer folks not get wrapped up in local folklore. Less trouble that way. I wrestled with my decision as I drove. A logical voice in my head said, "Mike, you owe it to yourself to stay safe. Go." Yet an emotional pull said I might find some kind of catharsis here. All these months since Nora's death, I'd felt numb, adrift. For a brief moment the previous night, staring at that lonely figure by the bumper, I felt connected. It was a twisted connection, sure, but it was something. That evening, I returned to the same spot by Oakwood Lake. The clouds had drifted off, revealing a late afternoon sun that glistened across the water. The forest smelled fresh after the rain, and a gentle breeze played across the surface. I made myself a small meal, then sat outside, watching the sky turn pink and gold. Occasionally, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement near the shoreline, but it was always at the corner of my eye, gone too quickly to confirm. Dusk settled in, and I felt the weight of the impending night press on my chest. At around 9:00, I heard it again. Faint giggling. This time, though, I steeled myself. I stepped out of the RV, holding a flashlight but keeping it pointed downward. "Hello?" I called softly, scanning the trees. The laughter drifted closer. Slowly, I moved toward the lake. The water gleamed under the rising moon, and I could see the silhouette of a small figure standing at the edge, ankles submerged. My throat went dry, but I forced myself to keep walking. She looked no older than 7 or 8, with long hair that clung to her face, water dripping down her dress. In the moonlight, her skin seemed almost translucent, as if she existed only half in this world. For a moment, she turned those wide, dark eyes to me. A wave of sorrow slammed into my chest, so powerful that tears pricked my eyes. I wanted to speak, but I found no words. She lifted a hand, beckoning me. A strangled noise escaped my throat. Something in me ached to go to her, to help her. But I also felt a deep terror that if I stepped into the water, I might not come back. She vanished in an instant, leaving only ripples on the surface. I stood there trembling until the hush of the forest pressed around me again. My heart thundered, and I realized my cheeks were wet with tears. It was as though some invisible barrier had broken inside me. The grief for Nora, the anguish I'd tried to bury, rose up and nearly overwhelmed me. But with it came an odd sense of resolve. This child, this ghost, seemed trapped in the place of her final moments, tethered by heartbreak. And I understood heartbreak all too well. I thought about what Catherine said. Sometimes tragedy leaves echoes. Perhaps all I could do was acknowledge that echo, show it some compassion. But how? I paced the shoreline, the wet ground soaking my boots. I remembered an old childhood ritual, placing flowers on a grave as a sign of respect and remembrance. Did the spirit of this lake yearn for something similar? It felt naive, but I couldn't shake the idea. The next day, I returned to the general store. I found a small bouquet of artificial flowers, the only kind they had, a child's wind-up music, box shaped like a star, and a simple plush bear. The gifts felt almost silly, but they represented some attempt at comfort. Catherine didn't comment. She watched me with sad understanding as I purchased them. She must have known my intent. Her only parting words were, "Be careful and be kind." I thanked her and left. The sky threatened rain again as evening approached. Thunderheads gathered on the horizon, painting the lake in sullen tones of gray and purple. I prepared a small campfire at the edge of my site, more for comfort than warmth. The wind picked up around sundown, making the flames dance wildly. Staring into the flickering light, I recalled holding Nora's hand in the hospital, the beep of machines marking the rhythm of her last breaths. My chest tightened, but I breathed through it. Letting go isn't about forgetting. It's about accepting what's been lost. At nightfall, I took the flowers, the music box, and the plush bear to the shore. The wind whipped my jacket and lightning flickered in the distance. Carefully, I placed the items near a large, smooth rock by the water's edge. Then I stepped back, hands trembling, unsure what to do next. For a while, nothing happened. The water stirred in the gusty air, lapping at the shoreline, black under the heavy clouds. Then, faintly, that laughter drifted through the darkness, or maybe it was just the wind. I flicked on my flashlight. Standing 10 feet away from me was the child again. Her hair hung limp, her clothes clinging, droplets trickling from her arms. She cast a hollow gaze at the offerings. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint, but I forced myself to speak, my voice shaky. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm sorry for what happened to you here. You weren't supposed to be alone." A sob caught in my throat because the words carried double meaning, for her, and for Nora, and for me. The small figure tilted her head as though listening. Slowly, as if uncertain, she stepped toward the rock. Her hand reached out, flickered like a reflection on rippling water, and touched the plush bear. The slightest smile crossed her face, an expression so fragile it nearly broke my heart. Thunder boomed overhead, and I glanced up, feeling raindrops splatter across my face. When I looked back, she was gone, replaced by a swirl of mist that danced over the lake. I stood there until the rain drenched me, hugging myself to ward off the chill. Eventually, I gathered my courage and returned to the RV. Sleep came in fitful bursts, punctuated by rolling thunder. Dawn arrived with a clearing sky, sunlight streaming through ragged clouds. I stepped outside, apprehensive about what I'd find at the shore. The plush bear and flowers remained where I'd left them, but they looked undisturbed. The wind-up music box lay on its side. I bent to pick it up, brushing away sand and water droplets. My breath caught when I realized it was wound. With trembling fingers, I flipped the tiny switch and a soft lullaby chimed out. I couldn't recall winding it myself, but maybe I had in a moment of confusion. Or maybe I hadn't. I stood in quiet, reflection, letting the gentle melody seep into my bones. The lake looked calm. For the first time, it felt peaceful, not ominous. I had no illusions that the place was magically rid of its tragic past, but I sensed that some barrier had lifted, if only slightly. Maybe this child's spirit had found a measure of comfort, a small acknowledgement that she mattered, even if she was long gone from the living world. My eyes burned with tears, and I allowed them to flow without shame. It was time for me to leave. The Adirondacks had given me what I sought in the strangest possible way, an encounter that forced me to face my own grief, to see the reflection of another lonely soul trapped in sorrow. I carefully placed the music box back on the rock with the flowers and the bear, then returned to the RV. I packed up, double-checking all my gear, heart thudding with nervous energy. As I started the engine, I glanced one last time at the shore. Nothing stirred. No figure, no footprints, just the placid lake surface shimmering under the climbing sun. I drove out, pausing at the kiosk to deposit a final envelope, even though I'd already paid. Inside, I wrote a brief note. "For thee, child who remains here, may you find peace." I had no idea if anyone would ever read it, but it felt right to leave something, some sign that her story mattered to someone. I reached the main road, heading back toward the small town, half expecting to see Ranger Ellis again. Instead, I passed. Only a few cars, the world oblivious to what had transpired at Oakwood Lake. Catherine's store was closed when I passed by. I considered stopping to tell her I was leaving, but maybe it was enough just to know that she'd pointed me in the right direction. That night, I found a motel an hour farther south. I took a long, hot shower and fell into bed, dreams swirling, with water and laughter, sorrow and release. In the morning, I woke feeling oddly lighter, not cured, not free of heartbreak, but as if I'd taken a step toward healing. Maybe that's all any of us can do, one small step at a time. Even now, months later, I sometimes close my eyes and picture Oakwood Lake, with its hush of trees and the mirror-like water that hides old secrets. I don't know if anyone else will ever see the ghost of that child, or if she'll finally rest. Part of me hopes that, in that single, fragile moment, she understood that someone saw her, cared for her, even if only with a stuffed bear and a sad apology. And in turn, maybe she helped me see my own pain in a way that let me move forward. There's a kind of redemption in recognizing shared loneliness. If we can reach across that gap, even between life and death, we might find a glimmer of peace. That's how I like to think of it anyway. My name is Mike Reynolds, and I'm 45 years old. This happened just last fall. I left a piece of myself by that lake, and I believe I took something back too. The small but powerful reminder that we're never truly alone in our grief, that sometimes all it takes is a gesture of compassion, even to a wandering spirit, to begin to heal the wounds we carry in our hearts.